Welcome to Explosive Enterprises, and today we're finally making good on our promise to review the Lambda GHM9, a surprisingly cheap gas blowback submachine gun that got on our radar as a potential good entry point to the world of GBBRs. The real GHM9 doesn't have much history to cover, so I'll keep this brief. B&T introduced the GHM9 in 2017 as a cheaper alternative to their militarily adopted APC-9. It's designed for modularity, with different lower receivers available for magazine compatibility and different barrel lengths and stocks that drop right in. Functionally, it's just a simple straight blowback 9mm for the civilian market, a plinker that is easy to build out with a brace or into a short-barreled rifle or suppressed configuration. While the real GHM9 is sold in this configuration to meet US legal definitions of a pistol, for Airsoft this is functionally a stockless submachine gun with a pistol-length barrel. That's something of an awkward profile, but one of the cool things Lambda has done, or Raptor or TWI, they're all the same company, is actually replicate much of the family of GHM9 parts. We'll get to that later, but first let's start with the externals on the gun as it comes. And, well, initial impressions aren't awful, but it's not great either. Where the real GHM9 has an aluminum upper receiver and plastic lower, the Lambda is all plastic externals. It's nylon, so at least decent plastic, and the smooth finish on the upper receiver does make it look a little different from the lower, but without a magazine this weighs in at just 2.7 pounds or 1.2 kilograms, and for how big it is, that makes it feel a little toy-like. Starting at the muzzle, the outer barrel is also plastic and has standard 14mm negative threading. It's enclosed in a plastic handguard which secures to the upper receiver by 2 screws and has both rails and M-lock slots. All pretty straightforward. The receiver continues the rail all the way to the back, pinned to the receiver by a couple of roll pins. This gun doesn't come with sights, so I'll just go ahead and add a SIG Romeo 5. On either side, 4 screws secure the barrel trunnion just like the real thing, but what should be an insert for the ejector is instead molded in. Now this is not the original charging handle, which is a simple post, rather it's an aftermarket folding design. Either way, since it's mounted in the bolt, it does reciprocate in use, and note that it can be installed on either side, which will show during disassembly. The receiver is also marked with a Swiss seal, as well as the B&T logo and place of manufacture, but since this is a plastic receiver, those are painted markings rather than laser etched. On the right side, we similarly find the model, caliber, and serial number, which is duplicated on the bolt, but the serial numbers are not unique to each gun. On the bolt itself, there is again the caliber and serial, and the wear that accumulates fairly quickly reveals it to be the usual pot metal. The lower has a bit more going on. On the left side, the magazine release is designed to be actuated with the thumb, while on the right side, a paddle release provides a more AR-like control. The bolt release is a simple block, push up to lock, or push down to release. This lower is marked ghm-g because it's the Glock magazine variant, and Lambda also makes a variant that accepts KWA MP9 magazines. The trigger is pot metal and is a simple AR-esque curved blade, while the safety is a plastic MP5-like ambidextrous pivoting paddle with markings for safe, semi, and auto. And the pistol grip, while a thin B&T design, is AR spec and can be replaced with any AR grip. Lastly, the receiver cap features a vertical section of Picatinny rail for installation of a stock if desired. Now over to the magazine. As mentioned, this is a fairly standard Glock magazine, but with a slightly different shell. Because this gun accepts magazines from a few different brands, I'm not going to talk much about the one that comes with it, except for the small note that while this magazine has a flat gas router, VFC or TM mags with curved routers still work in this gun. We'll talk a little bit more about magazine compatibility later, but this one weighs a hefty 360 grams empty, holds 32 BBs, and will hold about 12 grams of propane, but will siphon in full auto or rapid semi if filled past 10 grams. So overall, yeah, it's a plastic fantastic stockless submachine gun. It has a little bit of wobble between the upper and lower, but nothing critical, and otherwise feels fairly solid. It's just not going to blow anyone away with the external quality. But this is a cheap gun, and we've seen guns that cost more and feel worse, so I can't fault it too badly there. Let's take a look at the internals. So first, field stripping is like a mix of H&K and AR. First I pull out a cross pin securing the receiver cap, and then it slides out the bottom. That's enough to extract the recoil assembly, but I'll go ahead and pop out the second rear cross pin, and this makes disassembly a bit easier. With the recoil assembly removed, the bolt can slide far enough to release the charging handle. As mentioned before, the charging handle can be installed on either side, but with the charging handle removed, the bolt can slide out the back. And the bolt just slides right out. By popping out the front cross pin, I can fully separate the upper and lower. Note that these pins are retained via metal clips, and pay attention to their orientation during reinstallation. By default, the prongs face into the channel, which causes them to dig into the plastic and can make the pins extremely difficult to remove. It's better for the prongs to face out like this, and if they don't hold the pins tightly enough, just squeezing with a pair of pliers will increase the tension. That's the basic field stripping, so let's take apart the upper. First, the front rail comes off by removing 2 screws on the top and bottom. Note the taller one goes on top. And it's not obvious, but there are actually grub screws deep in the same channels, and loosening these allows the outer barrel to pull straight out. To be clear, the tension applied by these 2 grub screws is the only thing holding the outer barrel in place. This will be relevant later. Next, the trunnion is a big pot metal block that houses the barrel and hop unit. It's held in by 4 screws on each side, but only the lower rear ones are longer and also secure the hop unit. So I'll just remove those, and out slides the hop unit. Note that in theory you can do this without removing the outer barrel, but we found that the tension applied to the plastic barrel by the grub screws causes it to distort enough to grab onto the inner barrel. And here's the hop unit. I removed the screw, pop off the E-clip securing the adjustment wheel, remove it and the O-ring underneath, and separate the hop unit. The wheel applies tension to a hop arm with a basic cylindrical rubber nub, and the bucking has an angular contact patch that makes me think of a cross between a maple leaf bucking and a unicorn. These are standard GBB spec, so easy to swap if desired. The inner barrel is an unremarkable brass and a mere 95mm long, and note that up to about 100mm will fit within the outer barrel. I like this hop design, and spoiler alert, it's the best designed part of the gun. It's simple, easy to adjust, doesn't self-adjust, and accepts standard parts. My one issue with it is that it's a little fiddly to keep the nub aligned during reassembly, and if it gets squished to one side or the other, the hop will correspondingly skew to the side. The bolt is a whopping 150 grams with a charging handle, which is about the same reciprocating mass as a typical pot metal gas blowback pistol. It's pushing against very weak recoil springs, and you may notice that they're uneven lengths because they have uneven tempering and thus have worn in unevenly with use. At the rear of travel, the bolt hits a rubber buffer, cushioning the impact against the plastic receiver cap. To disassemble, with the charging handle removed, the nozzle stop lifts right out, and then unscrewing the return spring frees the nozzle. This is very similar to a Tokyo Marui spec Glock nozzle with a few differences, sealing against a TM spec 15mm piston head in the bolt. The rocket valve appears to be styled after a Poseidon ice pick, but curiously lacks the O-ring that is normally found on that design. That lack of O-ring doesn't make any tangible difference to performance though, so I'm not worried. And note that this can be replaced with any adjustable valve intended for a typical Marui pistol. Last thing to note, the total travel of the nozzle is about 1 inch. That means it only travels this far during recoil before it starts to vent, and has to rely on inertia to finish the cycle. We'll see the results of this later. In the lower receiver, the fire control parts are all housed in a trigger box like many WE or TM designs, but removing it isn't as simple as punching out the cross pins because it also requires removing the fire selector, bolt catch, and bolt catch transfer arm. With the bolt catch involving a tiny roll pin, I frankly don't want to deal with all of that and getting it back together, so in case you do need to get into the trigger box, we'll post a link in the description to a great pictorial teardown that ought to help, but for now, I'll just show you how it works. The trigger and disconnector are clearly patterned off that of an AR, but there's also an auto sear operating a second disconnector hook next to it. In semi-auto, the main disconnector grabs the hammer after each shot and releases it onto the main sear when the trigger is released, and in full auto, the disconnector is held back by the selector, much like on an AK, and the hammer falls every time the auto sear is tripped. Pretty simple, but there's noticeable wear to the trigger components, and that's because this hammer spring is outrageously strong. The reason for that is pretty straightforward. There's no valve knocker lock on this design, so the flow of gas cuts as soon as the hammer retracts. Couple that with the short travel distance before it starts to vent and the negligible mass of the bolt carrier, and the result is it needs a lot of pressure inside the nozzle to ensure it will travel far enough to pick up another BB. Most pistols also have short nozzle travel and low mass, but use a valve knocker lock to keep gas flowing even after the hammer is retracted. Here, it just uses a very stiff hammer spring to keep the bolt from moving until it has enough pressure to overcome the hammer. This will have performance implications, and it exacerbates wear and tear on the pot metal fire control group. Also, fun little detail, on an AR-style fire selector, the angle where the safety surface contacts the sears is critical, and it seems Lambda got it wrong. What does that mean, you may ask? Well, when I pull the trigger on the safe position, the trigger gets blocked by the shelf on the safety, but it's actually still applying torque to the selector, and if I pull just a little harder... Suboptimal. Okay, the last thing to cover in the lower is the bolt catch, and this is a simple pot metal block that gets lifted into the path of the bolt. That's a pretty good solution, but there's no spring here. It relies entirely on gravity to keep the bolt catch down during firing, and from the little bit of peening evident on the edges of the contact surfaces, it's possible the bolt catch is bouncing enough to just barely contact the bolt and start to round off, particularly if the gun is held at any angle other than straight upright. It's possible this was a necessary compromise to allow magazine spring to reliably actuate the bolt catch, particularly since its transfer bars imposing a significant mechanical disadvantage to the magazine spring, but it's really not ideal. So those are the internals. Even with under 1,000 rounds through the gun, I mean this is practically brand new, we're already seeing the recoil springs taking a set and the fire control part showing significant wear. Some elements of the design seem good, like the bolt and hop unit, while others are concerning, like the gravity control bolt catch, outer barrel secured via grub screws, and the quasi-functional safety. I appreciate simplicity of design, but in a lot of ways this just feels cheap. Well, controls and operation. First things first, the hop adjustment wheel is accessible through the ejection port, so it's pretty easy to make adjustments on the fly and no tools are needed. Inserting a magazine is easy with the bevel around the magwell, and mags lock in cleanly. Rack the charging handle, straightforward enough. The safety is a 45-degree throw for semi, but it's another 180 degrees to set it to full auto. That's fine, but I find that in the fire position, the right side selector wants to dig into my hand, and it's pretty easy to accidentally bump it back onto safe. Good thing it'll still shoot when set to safe, I guess. Anyways, the trigger pull is pretty bad. It's heavy, likely a result of the excessive hammer spring tension, and while I don't mind the fact that there's no take-up whatsoever, I do mind that when it breaks, it slops across that break point and then has significant overtravel. This slop is a consequence of wear between the trigger sear and the hammer, and will continue to get worse over time. Rapid fire is doable, but this trigger is not conducive to accuracy. When empty, the bolt locks back, and the mag can be released either with the left-hand button or the right side paddle. The paddle works fine, and I think this combination is redundant, and after wearing it in, the magazine does drop free. Insert a new mag and either rack the charging handle or thumb the bolt release down, and you're good to go. So, let's go shoot it. Well, the only reason this has any recoil to speak of is because it weighs next to nothing. The cyclic rate is surprisingly low considering the low mass of the bolt and that it has a total travel of just 2 inches, likely because the recoil springs are also so weak. The report sounds pretty underwhelming, and frankly, combined with the light recoil and clicky trigger, it feels more like operating a nail gun than shooting a firearm. Definitely not a gun to buy for the shooting experience, but let's check performance. For this testing, I'll be using the included magazine filled with 10 grams of propane as mentioned earlier. In continuous semi-auto, it stops locking back between 50 and 60 shots, then stops feeding around shot 70. If instead fired in strings of 32 with time to warm back up between, it manages 2 full mags, but starts failing to fully cycle before completing a third. That's not spectacular, but 2 mags worth of BBs per fill is workable. Now in full auto, it gets through the first mag fine, but after reloading and giving it time to warm up, on the second mag it starts to short stroke and gradually speed up. It shoots all the BBs but does not lock back, so full auto will realistically need a refill after each mag. With the mag chilled to freezing, surprisingly the gun is still able to cycle and does feed for the first few shots, but it isn't able to travel far enough to lock open at all, and it stops feeding long before making it through a full mag, so winter use is off the table. On the chrono, at room temperature we see the power is just under a joule, even using 0.32 gram BBs to exploit joule creep, which is not all that surprising considering the barrel is less than 4 inches long. Producing higher power will require a longer inner barrel, and then an adjustable valve may be a good investment. Consistency is fairly good, but cooldown over the course of a magazine is noticeable. At range, the stock hop-up is surprisingly competent, having no trouble lifting 32s and delivering reasonable accuracy. Again, not amazing, but if the power limits it to TQB use, then at least the hop-up will put the rounds where you aim. At this point we should talk about magazine compatibility. I've tested VFC, WE, and Action Army magazines, and all three seem to work mostly. For some reason, WE magazines are not only very tight in the magwell, they also don't seem to cycle as well as the other two brands, and we did test multiple magazines to confirm. This is strange because WE mags and Action Army mags are extremely similar to the Lambda mag, while VFC spec mags have a curved gas router yet work perfectly fine. So as far as mags, if you want higher capacity than the original Lambda mag, then VFC spec or Action Army extended mags seem to be the way to go. Now normally I would cover practicality before getting into aftermarket, but this gun was clearly meant to be modified, so the two really go hand in hand. First off, it needs a stock to properly evaluate it as a submachine gun, so I'll just pop the OEM one on there. This is a pot metal brick of a stock, and it both substantially increases the weight of the gun, and when extended, shifts the center of balance to over the pistol grip. Frankly, I would much rather have one of those dirt cheap plastic side folders, but it does function as a stock and gives a serviceable cheek weld. This is now a proper submachine gun, and as already mentioned earlier, the controls are a bit of a mixed bag. I find the magazine release and bolt release pretty intuitive and easy to use, but the selector digging into my hand is not ideal, and the safety being an unsafety is certainly not ideal either. There's rail space for a handguard, ideally one with an integral hand stop, but as with the Vector, I find it comfortable to just grip the front of the magwell, and the fencing will prevent accidentally dropping the mag. This is a CQB blaster, and it does that fine. It might be limited to anemic power, it might have a bad trigger and mediocre efficiency and generally bland shooting experience, but it's still fairly light and has decent ergonomics and puts BBs where I point it. Now the obvious next step is to bump up the power, and to house a longer inner barrel we can get either a slightly longer outer barrel and rail or this super cool SD kit, and this is where some of the design problems of that barrel setup surface. First, remember that the outer barrel is only held in by 2 screws at tension against it. With a metal barrel, it is necessary to thread lock them, but even then we've seen the barrel develop some play, especially with extra weight out on the muzzle, so a tracer unit can be a problem. And second, because the handguard is also secured with 2 screws and has a tiny bit of clearance against the receiver, it can pivot around the screws to wiggle from side to side, and in this configuration contact the suppressor and thus apply tension to the barrel. Not good, so probably better to stick with the more mundane 6-inch barrel, which with a corresponding inner ought to get close to 1.5 joules. And yeah, there's a CNC aluminum receiver, but aside from adding a bit of weight, it doesn't seem to change much as the finish is pretty similar to the stock gun. It's also an additional cost to a gun that is attractive primarily for being cheap and doesn't have any internal upgrades to correct the deficiencies we've observed. And since cost is the anchor to everything about this gun, that brings us to conclusions and pricing. Overall, it's a mechanically simple submachine gun masquerading as a pistol, using essentially a Tokyo Marui pistol blowback assembly coupled with an AR fire control group. While the bolt is simple and easy to work on, the fire control is already showing substantial wear from the combination of heavy hammer spring and pot metal internals, and is not particularly quick or easy to access. Ergonomics are similarly mixed, with mostly good controls, but clear defects in the safety and bolt catch designs. It's not very exciting to shoot, and the efficiency is mediocre and cold weather capability non-existent, but it does at least have a decent hop design. And this is an entirely plastic and pot metal gun that won't win any prizes for externals, and while it can be upgraded, there are clear design limitations and the price quickly skyrockets. So on that note, the gun itself retails for $200 USD, which is exceptionally cheap for a gas blowback submachine gun. Throw in either a few more of the OEM mag or a couple of extended VFC spec Glock mags, and in theory you can have a playable gas blowback CQB setup for about $320 or so. But that playable setup is limited to under a joule, it has no stock, it doesn't even have sights, so getting beyond that bare minimum means putting more money into it. For less money, you could build out a stocked AAP01, and in terms of raw CQB practicality, it would be strictly superior. But if you do care about appearance and materials, and go down the rabbit hole of CNC aluminum externals, the cost quickly balloons to exceed that of substantially better guns. In particular, the Maruyama SCW9 is an extremely similar gun that uses the same VFC Glock mags, and while it costs more, it comes with a stock and a metal upper, plus has better performance and better internal quality. It's possible we may do a comparison video in the future, because while it is more expensive, it is basically the same gun executed better and represents better value for money. If there's a place for the Lambda GHM9, it's for those who want a no-frills CQB carbine that doesn't look speed softy, but the value is only there if you keep it cheap. The gun isn't terrible by any means, it just doesn't have any particularly standout qualities besides that low price tag. In the absence of any critical flaws, the worst I can say about it is that there's nothing it does really well, but by the same token, it has issues, and I can't find any strong reason to specifically recommend it over the alternatives. It is truly one of the airsoft guns of all time. Well, that's all for today. If you'd like to support our channel, please consider checking out our merch store linked in the description. Either way, we appreciate you, and thanks for watching.